Alright, if you haven't been keeping up with my Standard series, there are 2 videos so far. I did an overview talking about my journey starting Magic Standard and why I enjoy the format, and then the most recent video was a mono-white Standard overview for the deck I'm actually playing. But as I've been going through, I've been kind of playing around with a lot of different decks, and again, I'll reiterate, this is meant to be sort of for people like me who are also new, getting into the format, coming back to it. I do not claim to be a pro, although I have been playing with these decks a lot, referencing a lot of other builds, and so on. So let's get into the overview for Mono Red in Standard in current 2023. Thank you guys so much for checking out the video. If you do enjoy what I'm doing here, please hit the like button and subscribe. Consider clicking the bell icon if you want to get notifications when new videos are uploaded. And leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Obviously, there's definitely going to be different ways to build this, different cards, different things that I didn't think about. So, yeah, I want to hear from everybody who, may be more experienced, because that way this could potentially serve as a guide for people who actually want to get into it and just want to get some baseline knowledge. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about mono red aggro, which is pretty much always a thing in some capacity. Even with rotations, like, there's always going to be new mono red cards that are good, that come out, and people want to play them. So, you can imagine that, it's always going to be something to consider, but there are times when it's weaker and times when it's stronger. The deck as a whole essentially plays a very quick, sort of like in-your-face, utilizing haste cards and damage cards to play low-cost cards and hit you fast and furious, like Mono Red tends to do. And so it's like a hybrid burn slash, quick turn kill type deck. Anyway, well, let's jump into the creatures. Alright, so creatures are definitely the most important component of this deck for the most part, and a lot of the builds you'll see online are definitely very creature heavy. Now, for the purpose of the overview, I am not going to be giving like a deck list per se, as much as I'm just going to be spotlighting some of the more noteworthy cards, talking about them a little bit, and giving you an idea of where you want to start when building your deck and going around. What I think is definitely mandatory is 4 copies of Monastery Swiftspear. So this card is back in Standard after being released in Khans of Tarkir. It was out of the format for quite a while and has come back, and it is definitely still very good. A 1-drop with haste and prowess. You can play a lot of things to buff that up pretty quick. Your low-cost damage spells, and you can swing early on to really put pressure on the opponent. Another card is Phoenix Chick. This is from Dominaria United. It is a 1-drop. It has flying and haste, but it cannot block. It does have an effect that says whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may pay red. If you do, return Phoenix Chick from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking with a +1/+1 counter on it. That doesn't come up as often, but it's definitely nice later in the game, and in general, just comboing this with some other cards in your deck, and it being a flyer with haste, is something to consider. Now, Bloodthirsty Adversary is a mythic. It is in Midnight Hunt, and unfortunately, this one's going to be rotating out with the next rotation, but hopefully we'll be able to find some cards to replace it. Obviously, there's still some sets upcoming that could give good, valuable options, but this is 1 in a red, it has haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 in a red any number of times. When you do, 1 or more times, you put that many counters on it, and then you exile up to that many instants or sorceries with mana value 3 or less from the grave, and copy their effects. You may play those copies without paying their mana costs. You can imagine later in the game, when you've got a decent amount of red mana, you can copy some of your burn spells and other cards of that nature and be able to put extra pressure on the opponent while also having haste. This card will definitely be missed, but hopefully, like I said, we will get some better options. Another really good important card here is Feldon Ranum Excavator. If I mispronounced that name, I'm sorry. It is 1 in a red with haste and it cannot block. You'll see that's kind of a theme here with the amount of damage we'll be putting out. Whenever it is dealt damage, exile that many cards from the top of your library. Choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. What this does is it gives you some additional resource advantage in a deck that kind of goes through your cards pretty quick. Regardless of, whether or not it's going to be hit for 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, you get a selection of cards you can choose from, and because they last until your next turn, you can, not have to worry about them all going away immediately. Feldon's pretty good, and he was in Brothers War, so he will be sticking around, which is definitely a nice thing for the deck as a whole. Now, some cards that seem to be showing up in the builds a little bit more recently are cards like Furnace Punisher. This is 2 in a red with Menace. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, deal 2 damage to that player unless they control 2 or more basic lands. I personally am not playing this card in my build. I think it's better suited in the sideboard than in the main, but I can't ignore the fact that it's popped up in a ton of tournament results lately, so it's definitely something that people are gravitating towards, and I like it. I just think that there's so many basic lands in Standard that it's not hard to, play around this, but I could certainly see, depending on the matchup, where you could put a lot of extra pressure on the opponent. Thundering Raiju is another one that's sort of like an optional but really good card to have access to. It costs 2 and 2 red, it has haste, and whenever it attacks, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then deal X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of modified creatures you control other than Thundering Raiju. Just kind of reading the effect, you can see where being able to buff up some of your smaller creatures and then deal damage on top of that makes this really good. It's just, a little higher cost than the deck typically wants to go into, but it's absolutely good and has seen play in a lot of these builds, so I kind of wanted to mention it. And another honorable mention is, of course, Squee, the Dubious Monarch, another really good card that I think is going to be a lot better after rotation when we're forced to implement some better options. He's 2 in a red with haste, and whenever he attacks, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that is tapped and attacking. You may cast Squee from your graveyard by paying 3 in a red and exiling 4 other cards from your graveyard rather than paying its mana cost. Not bad, puts extra pressure on the board, gives you another body, and later in games you do have a lot of extra like instants and sorceries that you've used that are going to be in the grave, so it's nice to have an option to bring him back. Like I said, I think he does get better as we lose some options and we need to find ways to slot him in, but other people are already playing him, so it's really up to you to decide what works best for you and what you're most comfortable with. And lastly, Reinforced Ronin is another one that I like. It's a 1-drop red 2/2 artifact creature with haste. At the beginning of your end step, it's returned to the owner's hand, and then it does have channel, pay 1 in a red, discard it to draw. So 2 damage is pretty solid. You're hitting for 10% of your opponent's life total on the first turn, but the fact that it bounces in the hand can be both good and bad depending on your circumstances. I do think that, we have a lot of other options to choose from, and we're not really losing any of our low-cost creatures with the rotation when it does happen. So I think, this is going to be one of those cards that comes down to personal preference and how you're building your deck kind of around him. Moving on, the deck does not play too many enchantments, but the ones that it does are very important. There are 2 that come to mind, and one of them is Kumano Faces Kakazan. That is a very, very good card. It is a 1-drop red enchantment saga. Its first effect says deal 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control. Its second effect says when you cast your next creature spell this turn, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and then its third effect exiles and transforms, returning to the field as Etching of Kumano. It has haste and then says if a creature dealt damage this turn by a source you controlled would die, exile it instead. So you can read this card and see why it is extremely good in multiple ways. Just a 1-drop saga that kind of gets going on turn 1 to deal some damage is good, but then you also have the ability to combo with cards like Phoenix Chick. If you make that on turn 2, it comes out as a 2/2 flyer with haste, and obviously, Kumano himself is actually quite good once you have him against decks that have things like Unearth that are going to go back into the graveyard. You can kind of force your opponent to not be able to do that. So it's a really good card, and you get a lot of value out of 1 mana, which is just something really solid. And then we have Mechanized Warfare. This is actually relatively new. This one was in Brothers War. It is 1 and 2 red, and it says whenever a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent they control, it deals that much damage +1 instead. If you start to stack copies of these, you can swing for 2, 3, 4 with Monastery Swiftspear, Phoenix Chick, etc. The longer a game goes on, if you manage to stay in it, the better this card becomes, but it can just really help to put extra pressure on the opponent, and often they're probably going to try to pop it or get rid of it so that it's not, sticking around to do excessive amounts of damage. Another enchantment that I've seen pop up in some mono red builds is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Absolutely an insane card that does a whole heck of a lot. I personally think it's not exactly great in mono red aggro because it's kind of slower to get where you're trying to go, but it's a good card that sees play in all kinds of formats. It's the reason it's a very high price card too. So I just wanted to mention it as an option for you. You might find that it works, or the way you structure your deck, you'll be a little bit more comfortable playing it. Moving on to Instants and Sorceries. This is another key component of the deck, I think, and obviously it'll vary a bit for people, but the most important one is definitely Play with Fire, which is a 1-drop red instant that says deal 2 damage to any target. If a player is dealt damage this way, scry 1. So it's basically a better version of Shock, which was obviously a good mono red option when it was standard legal. It's not quite as good as Lightning Bolt, which, we'll probably never have back in standard, I don't know. But Play with Fire is unfortunately going to be one that rotates out, and there are not any other cards currently with its same mana cost that have the option to deal damage to an opponent or a creature. So there's going to be some things that can take out creatures or planeswalkers, but we don't really have a strong replacement card for Play with Fire right now. Hopefully we'll get one in the next set, perhaps, to see if that can kind of, help with the low cost, ping removal against tougher challenges. Lightning Strike is 1 in a red, a reprint, of course, back in the format. This was Dominaria United. Deal 3 damage to any target. It's just a really good card. It can finish games, it can remove problematic threats, and it doesn't cost anything crazy, so this is just one that you absolutely want to make sure you're utilizing because it's just a really strong card for the deck. One I like a lot and that you see mixed in builds is End the Festivities. Some people like to side it, some people like to main it. It's a 1-drop red sorcery that says deal 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. Obviously, this works really well to like deal extra damage and trigger Monastery of Swiftspear's prowess ability, but it can also, you know, if you play multiple copies in a turn, you can clear the field early game to get rid of problematic things for you. Another card that, like I said, people kind of like to either main or side. It's just one of those cards I think is too good not to utilize, but, you know, I sound like a broken record, but do what you think is best. Now, like I said, creatures are pretty heavy, and this deck's, you know, variety in terms of the number of different cards it plays is not super high, because you really are kind of stacking up creatures and going there. Alright, so let's talk about Planeswalkers. Now, I'll tell you there's only one, which makes it easier for everyone, that is commonly played in here, although there are a few others that might get better when the rotation happens, but Chandra, Dressed to Kill, costs 1 red, and it has 3 Planeswalker counters when it comes out. You could pay 1 and add red to deal 1 damage to target player or Planeswalker. This extra mana is, of course, good because most of the things in the deck cost low, and then dealing that extra damage or maybe taking out a Planeswalker is not something to kind of scoff at. The +1 other effect is exile the top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn. Again, basically resources that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And then it's -7 effect, exile the top 5. You may cast red spells from among them this turn, and then get an emblem. Whenever you cast a red spell, deal X damage to any target where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. It's good. It's definitely something that if you can resolve can help, but it's honestly not... It's not the most important part of this card. What you really like is the resources and the extra mana should you need it while being able to damage stuff. Chandra is good, but it will be rotating out, and there are, you know, certainly going to be other red Planeswalkers that can kind of make, you know, moves for its spot. But whether or not it'll be as good or as impactful is something we'll have to wait and see. And finally, lands. This is pretty straightforward too. You play a lot of mountains, and that's basically it, but there are a couple of utility lands that are really solid additions. Mishra's Foundry is a 4-up in the deck, and this is a regular land that says tap, add 1 colorless mana, pay 2, Mishra's Foundry becomes a 2/2 assembly worker artifact creature until end of turn, it's still a land, and then pay 1, tap, target attacking assembly worker gets +2/+2 till end of turn. You're not really going to be using that effect too much, but turning it into a 2/2 creature basically gives you another body on board to either block with or attack with, while still being a land, and again, when you're really looking for low-cost ways to ping and hit for damage, this is going to be an essential part of your strategy. And then Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance from Kamigawa. It's the legendary channel land. Honestly, I think the weakest of them, probably. I think that's kind of fair to say, but still decent. You can tap to add red, or you can do channel, discard it, create 2 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens. They gain haste until end of turn. Ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control, so it would trigger if you control Feldon, you know, you can do it with him, but that's pretty much it. You don't really play any other legendary creatures, so it's more so just as like another option. The tokens can come in handy and can help you to kind of win games from time to time. Now, just overall, Mono Red is really fun and can absolutely win you games. It does a lot of damage really quick, and while it can be sided against to hopefully mitigate some of that if you're playing against it, if you're not prepared for it, the deck will absolutely do a lot of damage to you, and there are certainly matchups that are much stronger against it. Mono Black is definitely a deck that Mono Red struggles to beat. I would say it's probably its toughest matchup, Mono Black and Grixis, just with Sheoldred and with, you know, the big power cards and sort of not being able to do enough damage to get over those big creatures. If they start to mount up some kind of thing and ping out your low attackers with Cut Down or Infernal Grasp, things like that, it does become a bit more challenging. Mono White is another deck that like can be a bit tough for it, but it is beatable if you can outpace it, and I think it has really solid matchups against any slower decks like Mono Blue, and even Soldiers to an extent. I think it can take on pretty well as far as the current meta. So I think Mono Red will always be relevant in some capacity, but it really just depends on what the format looks like and what everybody ends up playing with. And of course, you know, there's still so many things that have not yet been announced or revealed that we could easily see, you know, different cards come out that make the deck better. So that's going to do it for me, guys. Let me know what you think of the video. If you do enjoy, please let me know in the comments down below what you think, and I will be back with the next video. We'll catch you next time. Peace.